Hi, everybody. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to the Institute of Cornish Studies. Right now we're in the Environment and Sustainability Institute, and it is with enormous pleasure that Amy is coming to talk to us about Ithell Colquhoun. First thing, a little bit of housekeeping. The loos are just through, and the fire exits are just through the doors out here. We're not expecting a fire alarm, so that's all good. Yeah. So, I knew about Amy, but you know when you're in undergrad, right? And you read stuff that like academics have published, and you're like, oh, that is so cool. And so I used to read the Institute of Cornish Studies stuff, like from the 90s and the early 2000s when I was an undergraduate. I was a mature student, so that was, you know. Anyway, so and of course, because Amy was one of the people that was working in the institute at the time, which was like big and thriving and doing all kinds of absolutely amazing things. So like I knew of Amy's research. I like, you know, her name needed to be in kind of like capital letters. Do you know what I mean? And then many years later, we joined the same Zoom call about it was an online it was a COVID, what do we call it? A COVID online seminar, and we started chatting, and then visited Amy in Atlanta last year, pretty much this time last year, and I love Amy's work. It's really fantastic, and also Amy's work on Ithell Colquhoun. You know, so Amy was instrumental in rescuing Ithell Colquhoun's work. I'm sure she's going to tell us a whole load more about this as well. So it's just really fab, and you know, and now she is a global writing superstar who has talked so much about her work and her forthcoming publication over the past couple of weeks that she's got laryngitis. So we've got to be very kind. So if you feel like moving a little bit further forward, please do. Anyway, with no further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Amy, Sunstone and Oak, the Celtic world of Ithell Colquhoun.
My presentation is on my phone. Let me get that. So first, Joni, thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I'm so delighted to be back at the Institute, which looks, boy, does that look, this whole thing looks so different than back in the day when I was, you know, had what was clearly the best job I will ever have in my life, working at the Institute of Cornish Studies on things that are just still so very dear to me. You know, now here it is, so many years later, and it's in fantastic hands with Joni and Gary, and seeing what's going on it just makes me so very happy, and it's really just feels like it's great homecoming being here and being able to share this with you. Some of you, if you're familiar with my work on Ithell, I actually started doing this work while I was at the Institute of Cornish Studies in the year 2000. And that's when I first heard of Ithell Colquhoun from Melissa Hardy, Dr. Melissa Hardy, who has sadly passed on, but whose work still remains very important and very vital, particularly in West Cornwall, working on and supporting the legacy of women in Cornwall. And she first introduced me to Ithell so many years ago while having lunch at her place, and said, "Hey, you should find out. How do you not know about Ithell Colquhoun?" I'm like, I don't know. She said, you need to go to the Tate and find her stuff. And, you know, from there, the ball was rolling. A lot of the work that I'm doing, the bio from 2020 and the current book out with Tate, which is called Sex Magic. And I will not be talking to you about that today. All of that was really made possible when the work was donated from the National Trust to the Tate in 2019. So we're having, and Tefan is here. I'm so pleased to see her. And we have a whole new era of Ithell Colquhoun scholarship that is emerging right now, and it's super exciting. Before I begin the actual presentation, I figure if you're here, you might know who Ithell Colquhoun is, but in case you do not, I'm going to give you just the briefest biography of who she is and why we're even having this presentation today. So Ithell Colquhoun is really, I think, known, depending on your proclivities, for two things. First, her dates were 1906 to 1988, and she is known as a surrealist painter and also as an occultist or esoteric writer and theorist and practitioner. And the way in which she kind of merges these two things together is really exceptionally interesting, especially in the present moment. So she was born in India, and she was brought to Britain when she was still an infant. And she had formal art training at the Slade. She got basically her art degree, her BA from there. She traveled after, in the 1930s, she traveled to Greece and to France. And then when she returned to Britain in 1936, she became very involved in surrealism. And she was already an occultist. Her occult interests were really the very center of her life. And so she started surrealism really in service to her occultism. She left, I'll get into this a little bit more in a bit, but she left surrealism, and she left the British surrealist movement in 1940 for a number of reasons, which again I'll get into. And in the late 40s, she started coming to Cornwall more regularly. She was off and on. She had a studio still in London. And sorry, so she had a studio in London. And she went back and forth with her husband Paul in West Cornwall in full time in 1959. Where she remained until her death in 1988. So the reason that I'm going to be doing this today is because her life in Cornwall was not only very important to her, but it was reflected in her writings and in her work in a way that makes it very interesting to other people. And it's also, I think, very relevant to how we look at issues of Celtic identity, how we look at issues of Cornish identity, and some of the various themes that are refracted through those particular interests and in her own sense of identity. So, having said all of that, I'm going to begin the more formal aspect of this presentation, which is a thing I will be reading and which will be illustrated. I'm gonna have to go over there do we have to point or anything, or do I just go?
No, I don't think we have a clicker.
All right, then I'll just run over and.
Yeah.
Hey, I don't have like a million images, so. All right, and again, I'm super sorry about my voice. So I can't yell too loud, especially for everybody who is comfortably at home. I'm gonna do my very best. So bear with me. All right. So. Ithell Colquhoun was what Marion Bowman would call a cardiac cat. She was not raised within a Celtic culture, but her Celtic soul was a matter of her deepest conviction. For Colquhoun, her sense of what was Celtic was deeply entwined with a branch of her spirituality and artistic expression that ran alongside and sometimes intersected with her hermetic pursuits. Her love of the Celts started early with her own ancestral researches, and it eventually caused her to settle in Cornwall part-time in Lamorna in 1949 after her divorce, and then full-time in Paul a decade later. She once wrote that her Scottish ancestry predisposed her to the type of second sight and the visionary states that would make her surrealism more successful. Although she loved Scotland and found it beautiful, she believed that the weather was too harsh for her, and that Cornwall would allow her to be surrounded by sacred landscape and Celtic culture in a more reasonable climate, for some definition of the word reasonable. Well, there's Ithell. Well, now, who am I doing? Where is it? There's Ithell. There's the reasonable weather in Cornwall right there. Like the other surrealists fascinated with the Celts, Colquhoun's gravitation stemmed from the magnetism of Celtic otherworldliness. And rightly or wrongly, she believed that as someone of both Scottish and Irish ancestry, she was heir to that otherworldliness, and by extension and Celtic transference, this forms the basis of her lifelong connection to and love of Cornwall. Colquhoun's deep attachment to the Cornish landscape and her ideas about Celtic mysticism inspired her involvement with a variety of Celtic groups and movements. She participated in a number of Celtic-themed spiritual organizations at key times in their development, which encompassed Druidry, Celtic Orthodox Catholicism, and later in life, groups dedicated to Celtic mysticism. Colquhoun's Celtic interests and identity form an important strand of her overall work, and they were key to her spiritual practice. Yet because they did not result in a significant body of paintings, this part of her magical biography has not received as much attention as her Hermetic work. Yet her Celticity was important in her understanding of herself as a surrealist, and she was a writer as much as she was a painter. Her Celtic interests fostered a number of essays and 2 books, which today are considered early books in the earth mystery genre. We can also see how the broader historical developments of Celtic paganism and Celtic spirituality in the late 20th century impacted her own thought and practice, where she accepted them and where she rejected them. Today, I will explore a small subsection of Ithell Colquhoun's Celtic interests, activities, and art, with the intention of coming to an understanding of how she might have constructed her own sense of identity in the changing and fluctuating Celtic world of the late 20th century. Her Celtic inputs and outputs were voluminous, and I can only address a few of the highlights here. But don't worry, we're going in the weeds with this one. I hope to provide some frameworks for her varying interactions with Celticity and some of the artistic products that emerged from these interactions over the course of her life. I also wish to unpack some of the cultural and intellectual influences that shaped her spiritual and artistic choices, and the ways in which she interacted with and intersected with various movements and ideas. But first, we will cover some theories and frameworks, and then we'll get into the stuff. I want to start by saying that Colquhoun's love of the Celts was not unproblematic. It was a highly romantic enthusiasm of the type generally found in English Romantic Celtophiles, and which didn't and doesn't always sit comfortably with ethnically Celtic communities. Colquhoun's characterization of the Celtic cultural nature as earth-loving, artistic, psychic, and spiritual, as Malcolm Chapman has shown in his still not controversial 1992 book, The Celts' Construction of a Myth, it shows that these function as discrete points in a construction of cultural otherness, situated in categorical oppositions that still contribute not only to cultural and economic marginalization, which have also provided a rationale for continuation of colonialist discourses. In her 1954 travelogue of Ireland, Crying of the Wind, she refers to the Celtic substratum of Britain as, quote, the collective equivalent of the repressed unconscious in the individual. It is the dream life, the irrational, the life of fantasy and humor. Cornwall sits right in the middle of this romanticized construction. It was colonized early, and although it retained independent political structures as late as the 19th century, the revived nature of Cornish language speech communities and its governance as an English county has created a tension around how Cornish Celtic heritage is often perceived. While many ethnically Cornish people feel wholly un-English, many English experience simultaneously a sense of belonging and an otherness in Cornwall that creates the perfect conditions for a fully accessible Celtic otherworld. This inconvenient conceptual placement of Cornwall in the English imagination has been the foundation for the romanticization of Cornwall in the post-industrial period since the late 19th century and into the 20th, when tourists, writers, artists, and spiritual pilgrims flooded into Cornwall to escape the urban and to embrace somewhere even more mythic. Yet the relationships between these incoming populations and the ethnic Cornish have not always been sanguine. The result is that there are a variety of peoples in Cornwall who claim some sort of affinity with the Celtic heritage, sometimes adopting identical icons to express their Celtic identities, but frequently with different motivations. For example, King Arthur may have a very different significance to someone who's interested in occult Arthuriana and someone who sees Arthur as an emblem of Cornish cultural and linguistic resurgence. despite her broadly anti-colonialist perspective with regard to Celtic peoples. Ithell Colquhoun was one of these incomers, and her love of Cornwall intersects with a number of the reasons people commonly relocate here. A long history of artists and creatives, a Celtic cultural heritage, and importantly for Colquhoun, a history of alternative spiritual settlements and esotericists. Cornwall is still to this day believed to be a land of ghosts, witches, and the paranormal. And throughout the 20th century, Cornwall's otherworldliness made it a magnet for settlements of occultists, pagans, and earth mysteries enthusiasts, who still continue to shape and impact the character of Cornwall. But it is equally important to understand Colquhoun's own sense of displacement. She was born in northern India and felt of that place even though she left as an infant. In the beginning of The Living Stones, she writes about her search for a spiritual equivalent and why she feels she found that home in Cornwall. Much of the motivation for Colquhoun's engagement with what is now more broadly known as Celtic spirituality was a belief in the existence of a Celtic wisdom tradition that flowed in the veins and the lands of Celtic peoples. Celtic spirituality is an umbrella term. Here we go. Existing in both pagan and Christian contexts, and both are relevant to understanding Colquhoun's spiritual pursuits. Although Celtic spirituality tends not to be a label of self-ascription, Druidry, earth mysteries, contemporary Celtic Christianity, and even in some cases Wicca, have all been understood as being related to this broader movement rooted in 19th century Romanticism, folklore, and ethnography. Celtic spirituality can be characterized as broadly nativist, with a focus on institutions and practices that are believed to be indigenous, and in a Christian context, frequently set apart from incursions of Roman Catholicism. Spiritual activities may include pilgrimage and the veneration of sacred landscapes, ritual activity around saints, even in a non-Catholic context, or local pre-Christian deities, celebration of saints' days, or the revival of agricultural festivals, and the incorporation of Celtic myth, folklore, or folk practices into ritual or liturgy. In both a Christian and non-Christian context, environmentalism and the divine feminine have both been adopted as values, which are believed to reflect the values of Indigenous British peoples, and so have shaped the ethics of these associated religious movements. I would argue that many of these features drove Colquhoun's expression of a Celtic spiritual identity, even as the category itself was changing and developing into more non-Christian religious identities after 1950. Colquhoun's Celtic sensibility was fiercely anti-modern. She believed that Celtic peoples were more close to their own nature when not subjected to modernizing influences or outside philosophies that would dilute the unique cultural properties that she valued, such as her belief that Celtic peoples had more natural psychic ability. There was no need for written history because past and present were not sharply distinguished, and man could enter the ever-present record if need be, since all veils were thin. One with his race, whether living or dead, he still retained kinship with supernatural beings. As modernism and civilization interfere with these abilities, in her view, Celtic primitivism needed to be preserved at all costs. Colquhoun particularly resented the intrusions of civilization onto Celtic sacred sites and landscapes, with which she felt a psychic and ancestral connection. Colquhoun could have been easily called a traditionalist, and that's traditionalist with a capital T, although it is not certain that she would have identified with that label. But she was well aware of that philosophical school and was deeply inspired by some of its key thinkers. Traditionalism is a philosophical movement which emerged in the early 20th century, and which is frequently associated with thinkers such as Rene Guénon, Ananda Kumaraswamy, and moving much further to the right, Ulysse Evola. Salient features of this movement include a critique of modernity and a belief in a return to a traditional society based on perennialist spiritual principles, which once guided the development and governing of ancient civilizations in the Golden Age, and which was handed down in a decaying world through initiatory traditions and mystical currents. It is believed the roots of this tradition can be seen in a number of religious systems, most notably those of the East in Hinduism, Islam, or in Orthodox Christianity. Traditionalists critique modern society as deeply degraded, chaotic, and corrupt, and argue that only through a return to traditional social structures, values, and belief systems can the world be redeemed and return to the state of divine order. In many ways, this view characterizes Colquhoun's view of the world, and certainly her view of Celtic cultures and her vision of them. We know that by the 1950s, she had read Gwynnell and referred to his ideas in correspondence and manuscripts. Notably, she was also influenced by the ideas of the decidedly not progressive Oswald Spengler and his 1918 publication, Decline of the West, which characterized Western civilization as being in a state of decay. For Colquhoun, the rejection of modernity, and particularly industrialization, could at least halt the degrading degradation of Celtic cultures. One cannot truly understand Colquhoun's enduring interest in things Celtic, and indeed her entire body of work, without acknowledging the impact of W.B. Yeats on her writing, art, magic, and even what we might consider her politics. Probably don't need to cover a lot about Yeats's history with the Golden Dawn or his complicated relationship to Irish nationalist politics here. But needless to say, his fusion of the Celtic and Hermetic sensibilities was deeply inspiring to Colquhoun, and she worked to synthesize these currents within her own life. Much of Colquhoun's traditionalist and anti-modern views of the world can be traced back to Yeats, in whom she took a very early interest, and in many ways can be said to have formed one of the deepest theoretical influences on her life's trajectory. Colquhoun discovered Yeats's work in the mid-1920s, when he inspired a number of her lifelong pursuits, including alchemy, the Golden Dawn, and her love of the Celts. Colquhoun met Yeats in 1937 at an art exhibition, although we know little of their conversations. His correspondence and manuscripts were also of interest to her and continue to inspire her work. She took a particular interest in Yeats's opaque and complicated text of vision. Don't ask me to explain that, that's not gonna happen. It was composed in the early 1920s, privately published in 1925, and released again in a second edition in 1937. This complicated text, produced with his wife, Georgie Hyde Yates, using automatic processes, addresses Yeats's view of the state of the world in cycles of decay and regeneration, and the need for cultural and spiritual redemption. A vision was also inspired by the work of Spengler, and we see through the works of both the themes of an eternal historical struggle, characterized by cycles of decline, regeneration through spiritual or religious attainment, and ultimate rebirth. By 1943, Colquhoun was incorporating some of the ideas in a vision, including Yeats's alchemical symbolism, in her own writings and art, and had also written an essay on the importance of this particular text. In fact, in Crying of the Wind, she relates having visited Yeats's wife and co-author collaborator on the vision to discuss the text and Colquhoun's own response to it. Most scholars, however, agree that Yeats's politics, while certainly conservative and aristocratic, were complex and not easily labeled. I think for our purposes here, the overriding theoretical influence on Colquhoun was that of the perennial, the cyclical, and the role of the initiate in helping to shape currents of history. Colquhoun's influences centered around the themes of the playing out of eternal sacred stories and systems of thought that reveal the deep structure and pattern of the cosmos as replayed in a variety of contexts. And this is why she experimented with so many spiritual systems. Another lasting influence in Colquhoun's interpretation of Celticity was Robert Graves' The White Goddess. The White Goddess came out in 1948, just after World War II, and prior to wider media promotions of Druidry and Wicca as Celtic-based native British spiritualities. The work is not what we would call historically accurate, but the fact that he centered so much of his theorizing around Welsh and Irish medieval narrative also helped to invigorate post-war cultural and spiritual movements which sought to reclaim an ancient Celtic spiritual heritage for all of Britain. Graves' elaboration of the work of Ithell Colquhoun, also known as Edward Williams, although better known as Ithell Colquhoun, which led to the creation of a Celtic tree alphabet, certainly took hold of many imaginations. We see references to the themes and ideas of the white goddess in many instances of Colquhoun's wider work, and is expressed in her esoteric interests, certainly as characterizing her interest in the divine feminine. But importantly, in demonstrating the foundational potential of Celtic mythology to reveal yet another instance of the sacred structure of the cosmos. So to sum up this section, Colquhoun had a number of philosophical and cultural influences through which she saw many of her Celtic activities. In short, Celtic peoples were the inheritors of an ancient wisdom tradition, which took many shapes, and which over time became lost to humanity. Much of this tradition had to do with the relationship of people to landscape. The esoteric current between people and their lands can and should be contacted and restored in order to regenerate both the people and the land. After Colquhoun starts living in Cornwall part-time in the late 1940s, and more so by her resettlement in Nepal in the late 1950s, she becomes deeply involved in a number of Celtic spiritual organizations, writes books about Celtic landscapes, and writes poems and essays on a variety of Celtic topics. So for the remainder of this talk, I'll focus on her interest in sacred landscapes, Druidry, and Celtic wisdom traditions, and also a bit about her poetry. Colquhoun's relationship with Cornwall was enduring, and she lived here at least part-time for over half her life. According to Eric Radcliffe, she started visiting West Cornwall as a child on holiday, and like so many, became enchanted with it. It's hard to know exactly when Ithell Colquhoun started visiting Cornwall as an adult, but in the Living Stones, she noted that she started visiting seriously during World War II, when she was escaping the Blitz. And as early as 1942, we can see some of the early studies she produced of megalithic monuments. In the late 1940s, after her divorce, she purchased a small studio in Lamorna, one that she called Vow Cave, a one-room studio that with very few amenities that she adopted as a place to paint and write part-time. She maintained a residence in London, however, for many years, until relocating in 1959 to Stonecross Cottage in Hull, where she remained until her death. After her move to Cornwall, the focus of her work shifted for about the next decade, as she became more involved in writing projects and esoteric pursuits, and she reduced her visual output, especially with regard to large-scale paintings. Ancient stone sites of Britain and Ireland. So I want to get on to sacred sites and landscapes, right? Oops, like this. Let me see. No, well, got that in there. That's all. That'll be good. Ancient stone sites of Britain and Ireland have historically played a significant role in imaginings of a Celtic past, and importantly, a Celtic priesthood, which possibly possessed advanced magical skills and technology. While we know today that these were not artifacts of Celtic civilization, the idea that the Celts were the inheritors of an ancient mystery tradition of the West, very likely transmitted to them by the mythical, superhuman inhabitants of the sunken land of Atlantis, has never stopped being part of the lore of Western esotericism, particularly in Britain. Colquhoun took the Atlantean origins of the Celts as a given. It is likely that the preponderance of megalithic monuments, holy wells, and remnants of medieval sacred sites that Colquhoun would have encountered in her early visits to West Cornwall inspired her interest in sacred landscapes, and even in what would later be known as earth histories. It was a mix of ideas about pilgrimages to sacred sites, ley lines, and theories about electromagnetic currents under the Earth's surface, combined with her emerging ideas about other dimensions, that Colquhoun develops her theories about sacred sites, which in many ways was 25 years ahead of its time. Some of Colquhoun's early evident focus on Celticity can be seen in her energetically based landscape studies from the early 1940s, after her separation from the British Surrealism. So I'm going to look here at two paintings done in Cornwall from around 1941-1942. Dance of the Nine Opals, and this one's at birth. These complex paintings include a number of ideas and theories that Colquhoun was working on quite feverishly, yet they never seemed to blossom into a major body of work. In the early 1940s, when Colquhoun was visiting Cornwall, she was concentrating theoretically and artistically on energy flows and portals, and these take shape in a number of her artistic projects at the time, including these particular works. These are early articulations of what she would refer to as the living stones, as she believed that they carried and could also transmit life force. Dance of the Nine Opals is multi-sourced in its inspiration. Most likely, the physical structure on which it was modeled is the beautiful Mary Maiden stone circle in West Cornwall, which contains 19 stones in near pristine condition, with a well-trodden pathway running through the center. There are a number of stone monuments in Britain called the Nine Maidens, including 2 of them in Cornwall, which appealed to Colquhoun's mythic sensibilities. She wrote that she believed that at the core, they were all the Nine Maidens. The lore of these sites, as with many stone circles, was that the stones were women turned to stone for dancing on the Sabbath. Colquhoun calls this a hexen dance, or witch's dance. In 1940, Colquhoun completed some delicate watercolor enhanced sketches on onion skin, which show beautiful naked women frozen in the stones mid-dance. It's likely that the lore of the women and the number 9 were both magically compelling to Colquhoun, but the remaining circles did not have the visual and energetic elements that she wished to explore. Colquhoun wrote a short essay to describe the complexity and variety of visual themes in Dance of the Nine Opals, and it's clear that she is perfectly comfortable in reading her own work in a complex, multi-causal way. Although Colquhoun's essay lacks a single motivating theory, the image itself reveals a clear set of underlying principles, namely, that the stones are in some way animated intelligences, that they conduct energy, and these sites themselves are conduits for some sort of subterranean electromagnetic currents. She refers to the golden fountain of energy that you could see in the last piece. Nope, there. So this golden fountain of energy is, she calls it a fountain of Hecate. The phrase was later made popular by Kenneth Grant, but here Colquhoun refers to the idea which entered Western esotericism through the popularization of the Chaldean oracles, that there were power centers of the earth associated with the goddess Hecate, presented in the oracles as a life-giving force. Her direct reference here was to its usage by Irish writer George Russell, or A.E., from his 1918 work on Celtic mysticism called Candles of Vision, although her ideas about earth energies were likely also inspired by Dan Fortune. There. The second subject of Colquhoun's landscape energy studies is Menantle. I'm sure you all know, a highly unusual monument in West Cornwall, consisting of a granite ring flanked by 2 short pillars. This formation has a long local association with healing. It is said to impact every condition from rickets to infertility, as long as the afflicted passes through the center stone in the right way at the correct hour. Cornish antiquarian William Borlase related some of these traditions in his 18th century text, although he himself believed that they had an origin in Druidic life. The sunset birth has similar features to Dance of the Nine Opals, yet Colquhoun was looking at different energetic aspects of the monuments, with the primary distinction being that the sunset birth references the impact of the monument on the energy centers of the body. In 1940 to 1942, we can also see her intense theorizing on sex magic in several bodies of work, with the focus on the flow of energy throughout the body. See also the video. Through the center stones, as we see here, is a faintly visible figure of a woman who is clutching the pillar stones on either end and who is passing through the center stone. We don't see her flesh. We only see her streams of her energy, which remain in streams of red, yellow, and blue. I've got a clearer. So here's a sketch of it where you can also see those streams a little bit more clearly. So the Menantle here is functioning as some sort of battery, which can act upon the energy channels of the human body. And this is actually kind of another interesting sketch of what she thought was going on at the sacred sites, because she's actually got this in a tesseract. So this is actually, she sees them probably, very likely, because this is what she's indicating here, is that all of these sacred sites were kind of, were portals. They were dimensional portals where you would be able to access another dimension if you knew the spiritual technology involved in order to do that. Although Colquhoun visually revisits the stone monuments of Cornwall in a number of contexts throughout her life, these two representations reveal a much deeper sense of theory that we see in her work, both before and after. The key is that she sees these stones and the very landscape itself as alive. If people are in tune with nature, they can enter in a spiritual and beneficial relationship with these sacred monuments, which she believed to be evidence of an enlightened Celtic spiritual system, which was not yet lost to the world. So this is something that if you were in the right state to do, you too could use this ancient spiritual technology as part of your own Celtic inheritance. It's actually a sketch. This piece here on the left is the way, because you've got a body that is actually enclosed in a tesseract as well. So there's kind of this comparison between the body as energy source going to a different portal and that also happening in the landscape. So these two pieces are kind of interestingly related. Move now into the 1950s. Colquhoun continues her focus on landscape antiquities with two full-length books, which might loosely be described as travelogues: Crying of the Wind, Ireland, and Living Stones, Cornwall. Peter Owen published The Crying of the Wind and Living Stones within 2 years of each other, in 1955 and 1957 respectively, and these represent the extension of her growing immersion with Celtic peoples, traditions, and their relationship with the lands in which they lived. These accounts are basically travel journals, records of her observation of place, people, and landscape. They hold interest for the modern reader with an interest in the development of earth mysteries and the development of 20th century Celtic spirituality as personal revelatory texts, providing a snapshot about the ways in which the landscapes and sacred sites of Cornwall and Ireland were conceived of as possessing a mystical characteristic for spiritually inclined travelers in the mid-20th century. At the time in which they were written, Colquhoun was part of an early wave of post-war writers, and today we might call them thought leaders, who were actively seeking the experience of the enchanted landscape excuse me, as a form of reclamation of an ancient British sacrality that had been badly muted by the devastation of war. For example, Wellesley Tudor Pole, who established the Chalice Well Trust in Glastonbury in 1959, was promoting a re-enchantment of the British landscape by encouraging pilgrimages to Britain's sacred sites, particularly those associated with St. Michael. Tudor Pole believed that this would help usher in a new age of spiritual redemption for Europe, with Britain leading the way. These books are artifacts of this sort of response to the landscape, particularly to that which is conceived of as rural, unspoiled, and also innocent. I feel that Crying of the Wind, here on the right, does not get the critical read that it deserves. It is generally not a very jolly text. Some of her observations are frankly cringeworthy, such as her disparaging comments about gay men in Dublin. And typical of Colquhoun, she pulls no punches in this personal and opinionated account of the Irish cultural condition of the middle of the 20th century. This isn't simply a journey of Colquhoun's earth mysticism. It's a challenging and sometimes angry depiction of an Ireland in decay, victim of the forces of the modern world and centuries of conflict and colonization. The book itself is rather unpolished and reads very much like reading an unedited, certainly an uncensored travel guide. The Crying of the Wind gives little context for Colquhoun's traveler observations. She jumps right into the text with a description of her stay in the Liffey Valley. We don't know why she's there, what year it is, how long her stay is, or who her companions are. It's only at the end of the first chapter that we learn the year is 1954, and that she's renting studio spaces for drawing. Although much of the delight in the text comes from her unusual turn of phrase and thick description of places in Florida, Flora. She includes a great deal of commentary and observation. She notes how run down many of the buildings are and the low living standards of the people in general. She is frustrated that women no longer wear their traditional dress. She is fairly critical of the new Irish Republic and is quite derisive of the role of Catholicism in the culture, feeling that it is suppressing the people's Celtic spirit. It's quite clear from the final sentences that she feels as though the Anglo-Irish got short shrift in the political fallout of the Republic and laments their lack of cultural and political influence. Colquhoun writes longingly of a pre-Christian time in Ireland, when soaking in mythology, where the people were more in tune with, quote, their race and with the beings of the other world, reflecting the belief that Celtic peoples flow easily between different realities and exist mostly in a natural time out of time. The same is true of all Celtic countries insofar as the same causes operate. The past is present in the wholly unconscious, and in regions not yet entirely divorced from it, essential care is not for ambition and the rationalized outlook. The sense of the individualized identity is softened, the ego tending to sink and be engulfed in the id. Achievement scarcely counts. Existence in relationship to the moment is all. No wonder that time loses its anxiety, or rather has reached an anxious pitch, the angles of space also bathed in an age-old ambiance, leaving aside their sharpness. The Living Stones, however, is so different to Crying of the Wind, and in many ways is Colquhoun's love letter to Cornwall. The writing is full of life and color, and reveals her deep affinity with the Cornish landscape, whereas Crying of the Wind is most often a tale of enjoyment. The Living Stones was published in 1957, but chronicles events and experiences of Cornwall, in addition to odd historical and cultural facts spanning the previous decade. This text, too, was illustrated by her vision of Cornish sacred landscape. But here, many of the illustrations, including the cover, featuring the famed Realogran stone, take on an explicitly erotic feel, where monuments are characterized as almost being in congress with the earth and ringed with pubic hair. The Living Stones covers a wide variety of topics, in addition to monuments, giving a unique snapshot of West Cornwall in the 1940s and 1950s. Druidry, the Cornish Gorseth, persistence of witchcraft and legends of Aleister Crowley, early settlements of alternative cultures and communities are all covered in the book. She also describes, at that time, the recent trend of pilgrimages to St. Michael sites and describes her own visitation of them. She also expresses her belief they are related to points of extra magnetism in the earth, which inspired ancient ritual activity to solar deities. But a key theme to which she continually returns is the peril that Cornwall faces at the hands of modernization, and especially noise. The 1950s and 1960s were a flurry of magical activity for Colquhoun, and she joined a wide variety of initiatory orders, all of which had roughly similar missions having to do with achieving enlightenment. In the early 1950s, Colquhoun met Ross Nichols, who was already involved in the ancient order of Druids, also known as the British Circle of the Universal Bond, or I'm not going to do the Irish today, ADUB, which Colquhoun would eventually join. The two were in the same poetry reading circles together and were often on the same bill as early as 1952. She clearly found common ground with Nichols and began to attend rituals at Stonehenge with him. By 1958, she had joined the ADUB, remaining a member for about a decade. The curriculum of the ADUB was not particularly Celtic in content. It had a much more perennialist sensibility and seemed to be an attempt to develop more of a synthesis of Indo-European spiritualities. Later writings by Thomas Maughan, who remained as head of this order after Nichols' departure in 1964, characterized the order as representing one branch of the ancient wisdom inheritance from Atlantis, similar in training and character to the mystery schools of Egypt, and focused on individual enlightenment. There remains no barrier to entrance from members of any religious tradition, as they believe that Druidry reflects the light of all faiths. Despite her earlier friendship with Nichols, when he departed the order in 1964 to start the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, she appears not to have followed him. Colquhoun has moved on from institutional Druidry in 1968. More than once in Colquhoun's esoteric career, she became involved, even if only tangentially, with organizations devoted to promoting some form of Celtic Orthodox Christianity. Although many of Colquhoun's interests involved Christian iconography and symbolism, she once commented that Christianity was boring, quotes, and she generally referred to herself as an animist. So what was the attraction of these types of groups and orders? She was clearly invested in the deep sacrality of the land of Britain. She might have also been compelled by the idea that there were native Celtic wisdom traditions that would have intersected with wider ancient wisdom traditions, and that through initiations, she could contribute to that current and be involved in something that would resonate with her own sense of ethnicity. In other words, as a Celt, these traditions were also in her blood. I believe that while Colquhoun was involved in a number of traditions that used Christ imagery to represent an ascended state, that to describe her as a Christian is an attempt to normalize what was clearly a complex and multifaceted spirituality. In 1960, 61, and 62, Colquhoun traveled to Brittany to take part in the Breton Gorsons. The Breton Gorsons is and was officially affiliated with the Welsh Gorsedd and the Cornish Gorsedd, and like its counterparts was founded as a cultural organization that was meant to promote native Celtic Brythonic languages and cultures. The Welsh Gorsedd is the parent organization of the three, and it's customary for each organization to receive members of the others at their yearly festivals. However, in the mid-20th century, the Breton Gorsons began reciprocal visiting arrangements with members of the ancient order of Druids, and also fostered relationships with members of the ancient Celtic Church, now known as the Holy Celtic Church International. Well, this is really nerdy, but I still think it's kind of interesting. The charismatic founder, Jean-Pierre Daniel, also known as Turdwell, was a heterodox Christian, kind of hitching his wagon to Breton nationalism to promote a branch of Celtic nativist orthodoxy. Turdwell believed orthodoxy was well suited to the Celts of the 20th century, and which would also wean them away from Roman Catholicism. As the ancient order of Druids had a firm Christian membership, and many believed in the fiction of a smooth transition between the doctrine of the Druids and the early Christians of Britain, this set of organizational relationships made perfect sense, and would have to Colquhoun as well. In 1960, on a visit to the Breton Gorsons, Colquhoun was baptized in the ancient Celtic Church. In 1961, she returned and was made a deaconess. This very likely would have been in line with Colquhoun's interest in philosophical traditionalism, which was sometimes aligned with orthodoxy. Colquhoun was hoping to be made a bard of the Cornish Gorsedd, but no go. Unlike the Breton Gorsons, the other ethnic druids as opposed to spiritual druids, the other ethnic Gorsedi did not recognize, quote, English druids, and in fact were hostile to them at the time. In the early 1960s, the Breton Gorsons came under censure from the Welsh organization for their acknowledgement of esoteric druidry. And in Cornwall, the Gorsedd historically had worked to distance itself from any association with contemporary pagan druidry. Quote, English druids were believed to be culturally appropriating Celtic tradition for ends that were not native, and which did not reflect the Christian identity of these primarily political bodies. It may also have been the case that any association with esoteric movements may have further marginalized these groups and would have culturally muddied the intent of a body that was seeking further legitimacy for minority cultures and languages. Colquhoun's friend and fellow witchcraft enthusiast, William Painter, tried to have Colquhoun awarded with a bardship, but Painter's petition was rejected and Colquhoun was never made a bard of the Gorseth. However, she commissioned a magic mirror from the celebrated Newlyn copper artist, Francis Carkey. Look at that. He was responsible for the ceremonial copper that the Cornish bards wear. So she got to carry at least a little bit of the bardic mojo. And I think Rib Davey has a lot of mojo. That's just me. In 1965, Colquhoun joined William Bernard Crow's Order of the Celtic Cross. This was the culmination of several decades of contact with Crow and his interest in his spiritual work. Crow was an active occultist throughout the 20th century, and it's no surprise that his interest in magical societies, which focused on ideas of lineage, initiation, and transmission, intersected with Colquhoun's. Colquhoun would have first encountered Crow in the early years of her esoteric enculturation in the 1920s at the Quest Society, of which they were both members. It may well be that her involvement with the Ordo Templi Orientis in 1952 was also an artifact of this particular relationship and friendship. She sought membership in Crow's Order of the Holy Wisdom as early as 1952 and was finally made a member in 1959. And there's her friend Crow. Still kind of an interesting, hard to find information about figure. It's a pamphlet from, again, this material is really difficult to come by, but this is kind of a page of the work of the Order of Holy Wisdom. It was exceptionally perennialist in its outlook and sought to teach the ancient wisdom religion, including that of Druidry. Of course, this would have been appealing to Colquhoun's sensibility and eventually would have dovetailed nicely with her Druidry, which she was doing at the same time. Crow was a French Catholic, having become priest in the liberal Catholic Church in 1935. Like Colquhoun, he was explicitly interested in traditionalism. Much of Crow's involvement in orthodoxy involved various British nativist Orthodox orders, which argued for a native, quote, non-Oriental British Orthodox Christianity that was partially derived from the teaching of the Druids, conveniently circumventing both Catholicism and Judaism. Although this seems like one small order among many that Colquhoun joined during this period, and little is known about its work, this reflects how Colquhoun was synthesizing her Celtic spiritual identity with her other magical pursuits, and how she intersected with the various landscapes of Celtic spirituality as it was developed during the 1960s and 1970s. By the late 1960s, Colquhoun's interest in Celtic spirituality continues to dovetail with her writing, with an emphasis on poems and essays. But another thing that's interesting that we start seeing around this time is 1960, so we start seeing the rise of contemporary paganism. We also start seeing kind of different movements in Celtic nationalism, identity politics. We start seeing kind of an infusion of different values into these, again, with ideas of not just the divine feminism, but other types of political ideas, specifically environmentalism. So we're going to see, as we kind of continue here, how Colquhoun's journey with Celtic spirituality kind of moves out of this one type of Druidry and this orthodoxy into this movement that is now being infused by a kind of nascent feminist and environmentalist movement in the 1960s and 70s. An interesting poem, probably written in the late 1960s, called The Living Boy, is dedicated to the Breton sculptor, Patrick R. Guarnig, the son of Breton activists who fought the French state in the late 1940s to give their children Breton names. The poem supports the bold self-determination of the family, and once again, returns to Colquhoun's common theme of preserving the wild and unspoiled Celtic landscape and character. In 1971, she published a piece in Dennis Fell Baker's Cornish Review, which was a collection of very localized phrases and lore that she collected from local elderly people she knew in West Cornwall, very possibly also people who worked for her in Hull. This article, too, decries modernization, even that of the farming industry and the encroachment of suburbia, and suggests that these factors were diluting the pure folk wisdom of the Cornish. In 1973, Eric Radcliffe, publisher of Orr magazine, and later one of Colquhoun's biographers, published a small illustrated text of poems called Grimoire of the Entangled Thicket. And this is became the cover of that, but she did this in the 1940s. She had originally written or planned to write 22 poems for publication, which reflect the work that she had been trying to achieve, synthesizing Robert Graves' tree alphabet with the 22 paths of the Kabbalistic tree of life. It would appear that she never completed the sequence, or that they have been lost to us. But this is one of the poems that that still remains. And these were published by Radcliffe, also with sections of the tree alphabet and calendar, and work with a number of other correspondences that Graves provides in the White Goddess. So this, if you look in the original White Goddess, you will see these images here, and Colquhoun actually kind of reworks them in a super interesting way. There are visual elaborations on these diagrams, and they show her extension into, because the one on the right here kind of synthesizes both Kabbalistic and Druidic ideas with the Awen and kind of how that might fit on a Kabbalistic tree of life. By the mid-1970s, Colquhoun became involved with Colin Murray's Golden Section Order, with which she remained an affiliate until quite late in her life. The Golden Section Order was a group devoted to developing a pan-Celtic mystical tradition based in mythology and earth mysteries, but which was also infused with the agenda of a pan-Celtic nationalism. Other members of the GSO included Patricia Villiers-Stewart, Stuart Farrar, and Caitlin Matthews. And if you're familiar with the Graves-inspired Celtic tree oracle, it was designed and illustrated by Colin Murray. The Golden Section Order seemed to be a highly romantic enterprise, and it would appear one aim was to re-Celtify England by highlighting its pre-Christian past, and also through building connections and alliances with ethnically Celtic movements. It's quite clear from Colquhoun's correspondence with Murray that he was truly trying to create a Celtic spiritual identity that would be compatible with nationalist politics, but this vision was not to succeed. Ads in the back of the Golden Section Order newsletter promoted various political ventures, including the enterprises of some Cornish cultural activists and nationalists, such as the Nationalist newsletter on Banner Canoe. In fact, James Wetter, the leader of the Cornish Nationalist Party, which you may or may not know is a separate party from Benny Kernow, was clearly involved with the Golden Section Order at some stage, and a letter to Colquhoun from Wetter in 1978 discussed the possibility of her contributing to his newsletter. At times, Murray seemed rather frustrated that more Celtic activists were not getting the point. A 1977 note to Colquhoun states that he had wished to propagandize prominent Cornish activist Richard Jenkin with the, quote, actual Celtic mysteries. But he knew he would most likely not be successful. So I know this is kind of hard to read, but in 1976, Colquhoun seems to have been involved in putting together a Golden Section equinox ceremony with a distinctively Cornish flavor. She possessed draft ritual banner and script for the autumnal equinox in the style of the Golden Section Order, laying out each part of the ritual. It's unclear where this ritual was held, but the script says that the officiants were hailing from London, Hull, and Helston. It's likely that Colquhoun's companions in this were Beryl and Archie Mercer of Helston. Portions of the ritual script were in Cornish, using the opening prayer from the Cornish Gorseth, which is up here in section 9. And also incorporating a poem in Cornish by Cornish revivalist poet Edward Chagwin, which is down here, number 10. Another section includes remembrances for Dolly Pentreath, early Cornish language activist Henry Jenner, antiquarian William Borlase, and an early Grand Druid of the Breton Gorsens as well. This banner reflected the aesthetic sensibilities of Cornish cultural activists at the time and shows the co-impact of Celtic spirituality and Celtic ethno-nationalisms in helping to create emblems of cultural difference. Yet while Colquhoun was clearly lending support and talents to this ritual, it seems to have been a relatively isolated occurrence of her expressing an explicitly nationalist sentiment. Colquhoun was clearly inspired by the Celtification of Britain project undertaken by her compatriots in the GSO. Her archives show a 1976 architectural design for a monument to commemorate the Queen's Jubilee in 1977. The monument, rich with symbolism, represented a huge vulva with a hexagram and Celtic cross in the center, intended to be placed on a hilltop in London. It was a celebration of the goddess of free speech and the union of the old religion and the new. It's unclear if these plans were ever submitted to a competition, but the project never seemed to have progressed beyond the draft stage. But come on, can't we envision it? Ultimately, Murray's spiritual emphasis became increasingly at odds with the discourses of ethnicity and indigeneity that were to define Celtic political identities even more strongly in the 1980s. Yet it was probably as part of this spiritual community and milieu that Colquhoun came to join the Fellowship of Isis in 1977, which shared a number of members with the GSO, including Colin Murray, Caitlin Matthews, and her old friend Ross Nichols. The emphasis of the organization focused on the divine feminine in all her aspects, and was in alignment with many aspects of Colquhoun's spirituality, especially the relationship between the Celtic and the perennial. Although Colquhoun had always fought for the acknowledgement that there was a divine female counterpart to the divine male, it was really only at this moment in history that a goddess-focused organization could emerge that would reflect her sensibilities. Further, the Fellowship of Isis had solid roots in Celtic spirituality, yet it was only celebratory and without explicit aims regarding matters of Celtic sovereignty. Through Colquhoun's involvement in Celtic spiritual organizations over a roughly 25-year period, we can chart a consistency in the types of organizations with which she chose to align herself. First, they were all to some degree rooted in the notion of an ancient wisdom tradition of which the Celtic was only one expression. Many of these organizations also interpreted Celtic identity as the foundation of a pan-British indigeneity, which the English could feel they legitimately can claim. This allowed Colquhoun to access a Celtic identity that structurally focused on the traits and characteristics of Celticity that she valued, such as spirituality, which kept her at a comfortable distance from Celtic ethno-nationalist politics. This does not imply that Colquhoun did not have opinions on Celtic ethno-nationalism. She frequently asserted positions that were anti-colonialist and ethno-nationalist regarding Ireland, Cornwall, and Brittany. However, her energies were more directed toward a Celtic spirituality that she likely felt was serving wider needs. In essence, Colquhoun was seeking Celtic organizations that reinforced her own ideas about Celticity and supported her own Celtic identity, mystical, otherworldly, nature-focused, and primitivist. From time to time, these groups intersected with Celtic ethnic politics, and it was clear that Colquhoun was a supporter of their aims. She certainly found connection and legitimacy from her long-standing relationship with Cornwall, and given Cornwall's historical circumstance, it may well have been easier for her to claim her own Celtic identity here in a way that went somewhat unchallenged. In conclusion, Colquhoun had a deep love for Celtic peoples and also a love of Cornwall, where she made her home. Although she frequently expressed an anti-colonialist position and advocated for the preservation of uniquely Celtic cultural traditions and institutions, this would have meant a return to a natural, quote, natural, pre-modern and pre-Christian position, where Celtic peoples could benefit from their supernatural talents and sensitivities. This would have given her limited compatibility with developing Celtic ethno-nationalisms, concerned primarily with self-determination and preservation, which tend to have a different perspective on history and identity. Although Colquhoun's mission was clearly located in spiritual Celtic identities, still important and useful to acknowledge the deep strains of cultural preservation and also cultural sensitivity that ran through all of her writing on Celtic topics, even if many ethnic Cornish might have viewed her as an outsider. Her life and preoccupations were firmly in opposition to her urban experiences, which she called the claustrophobic fright of cities, which could only be healed by a connection to the land and a cessation of progress and modernization, which to her was destroying the Celtic spirit. Thank you. There's beautiful Amorna.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was really interesting. We've got a whole bunch of time for questions. So would anybody like to pick us up? And anybody who's joining us on Zoom, if you want to pop a question in the chat or put questions in the chat, then we'll make sure that those get fed through to Amy. Who wants to kick us off with a question?
I know that was a lot, so thank you.
Was ever involved with any of the more pagan aspects of practical ritual?
Absolutely.
Because right before she joined was kind of ceremonial, kind of fire ceremony magic, wasn't it? As opposed to kind of more of the earth traditions that are sort of more female based.
So over time, when we start to kind of see. It's really interesting looking at what she chooses to join, and you can kind of see through that just wider changes in British magical culture. So she kind of starts off, and I think her primary love was really in this kind of, hardcore hermetic tradition. But as we see more openings within, within British paganism, obviously she was a Druid. But we start seeing her interested and in doing ritual activity. Golden Section Order did have rituals. She was involved in them and she did engage in ritual activity. But there are certain things that she didn't do, which is also really interesting because she did so much that what she didn't do ends up kind of being fascinating. So for instance, she was not involved in traditional witchcraft or Wicca at all. She didn't go that route. She also didn't become involved, to my knowledge, in any of the more intensive goddess focused groups that were emerging in the 70s. By that time, she almost might have been it might have been uncomfortable just a little because she was older, just getting much older at the times when those were starting to really emerge in terms of a lot of ritual activity. So she did do ritual. I kind of wonder what would have happened had she been maybe a little bit younger, just a little bit, to see where she might have gone. But she, I think really probably Fellowship of Isis was about as far along that path as she went. But she did later in life, she did do things like, she was writing for, it's called Wood and Water, I think. It was a much more pagan, explicitly pagan oriented, environmental, like very environmentally driven little magazine. And so I kind of wonder what she might have done.
It's interesting in terms of their interest in what is local, what is European, was very active at that in the late kind of 70s, early 80s, and what she lived in.
It has always.
She wasn't involved.
I've always been super interested in that. She clearly had dalliances, probably more with traditional witchcraft than with Wicca. But she, to my knowledge, maybe she pay a visit once or twice. I don't think that what we would call magical religious witchcraft, I don't think it was her jam.
That was fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. One of the things I really liked about the talk that you just given was showing us quite a bit of her development as well. I think as a person. So she's joining different organizations, and there's quite a bit here that I read as I just wonder whether there's some tension between sort of, the divine feminine and her feminine. So the masculine, a lot of her life journey, just looking at this relationship between, Druidry and the earth-centered sort of religions, but then also coming back into looking at Catholicism and the symbology of Christianity, which would appear in some respects quite opposite to that really. And then this idea of like ley lines and love of the earth and the standing stones, but then I see also, she's kind of coming back to sort of Celtic orthodoxy, etc. And a lot of the people that she's drawing inspiration from are actually men as well, as sort of the more feminine traditions. I'm just wondering, do you read any of that in her you know, in her history, it was sort of like any sort of tension, because, you know, she's rejecting modernity, which can be read as a rejection of patriarchy in some respects, right? But at the same time, you know, embracing some of it as well, particularly some of the symbolism and symbology. And I just wondered if you could comment on any of that, in you know, any of the tensions between masculine and feminine in her work.
Sure, and thank you very much for asking that, and so, I mean, I'm not necessarily here to plug the new book, but that's actually the focus
Next
of,
one.
oh, that one, oh. Have you read it?
Not yet, I only just got it. I mean, it was like delayed for ages. I finally got it like, you know, 2 days before.
Fantastic, oh, well, so a lot of the answers are actually going to be in there, and by the way, just letting everybody know, we're doing a launch for this on Friday at the Admiral Benbow in Penzance. It's gonna be on the top floor. It's gonna be totally rad. Y'all are invited, so, you know, please feel free to join us. That goes for anybody online too, here in Kernow or close to Kernow. Just come on down, we're gonna have a good time.
So I'm gonna get the answer to my question by reading this book.
Well, yeah, but I will, it's a really interesting question. And it's funny, you know, as I'm revisiting this material, looking at it in relationship to exactly some of those issues, because in here I talk about her relationship to orthodoxy, and if you read, you know, if you look in that book and you're like, wow, well, that's unorthodox. However, her ideas about what she thinks were right, because she's super rule bound, her own personal ideas about that are, well, no, I mean, really, we are all trying to be the hermaphrodite. That's what we're all trying to do. That's the way it was back in the day. That is the most pure state of human existence and relationship to the divine, is that we are both, and that's what we need to do, is we need to transcend gender in order to reach the divine state, which sounds today like it's, you know, and some of the things that she was doing that you will see in that book, where she's probably got, like many very essentialist ideas of masculine and feminine, but who needs to be in that body, that's not clear at all, right? Because there are definitely clear energetics in that text. And so that seems, because nobody else is doing it, it seems like it's really radical, but in her own mind, no, because that's the truth and that's the way that it should be. So although in you know, some of the things that I'm talking about, she's relating to men, because in those magical orders, there were men who were heading them. But whether or not she was taking, like in that book, just recently realized, fantastic, if you look at, there's this really great glowing picture of the second Adam, who is again referencing this idea of a Christ or Adam figure that was actually the divine androgyne, because you can't be divine with being an androgyne, right? Her origin for the theory of that was actually reaching back to a 16th century woman mystic. So she was seeking out female spiritual authority. Why she doesn't do more with Hildegard Bingen that I've seen is just still a mystery to me, but she is seeking out feminine authority in both art and spirituality when she has the chance. But most of those heads of orders in the 20th century were just simply men.
Or Rosalind Paul's Gerald Gardner, you know, Alistair Crowley, and
Yeah.
it's just by men in all the mystical traditions, really.
Yeah, and she was
So,
super ambivalent about
what God, right?
and she was super ambivalent about clearly a lot of those male men, even when she was inspired by them. I mean, she loved Mathers. She loved Mathers and the Golden Dawn. And I think one of the reasons that she loved Mathers is because the Golden Dawn itself was the first order that allowed women on an equal basis to men. And in fact, you can't become an adept of that order without saying that you promise that you will not bar women from initiation. So I think that's one of the reasons why it was important to her. And there are all these things about the divine feminine that Mathers writes about. So yeah, I think that her her relationships with her own desires, with her own sense of gender, with her own sense of sexuality were challenging to her. And it's really in that body of work that a lot of that becomes much more explicit.
So it seems to be like a quest for integration, but if you think about it, isn't that the case for all of us?
Yeah.
I mean, I'll say more after breakfast, but.
Oh,
Thank you,
enjoy,
thank you.
and yeah, feel free to contact me, let me know anything.
Did Indian mysticism have any position?
That's a great question, and in fact it did, and over the course of her life. I think her relationship with Indian spirituality kind of waxes and wanes. She felt very strongly, you know, as I was kind of talking about this idea of, you know, her relationship with the Celtic. And how she defined her own inheritance relationship to that tradition. You know, that was the focus of this, but very early on, she writes these incredibly angry, frustrated, sad, mournful little pieces about how she feels. She says, you know, I'm an animist. I was born on Indian soil. Why can't I have that? That's how I feel in here. I feel I want to be attached to those traditions. Why can't I do that? And then there are other points where she says, well, because in fact, those aren't mine. And so that's another thing that she kind of struggles with. She said, you know, I used to think that was mine, and now I realize it's not mine. And it kind of in brackets, and now I'm stuck in this kind of this Christian society that she sees as being very death focused. And so, you know, that really frustrates her because she sees the Indian traditions as being more vibrant. But so, you know, throughout her life, she still engages heavily with yoga, as anybody, you know, who's doing magic during this period does. So she does a lot with yoga. She's also clearly, again, in the book, interested in tantric traditions, not only sexually, but also, I believe, in relationship to ideas of taboo and transgression. So she does engage with those a lot. And I think that's kind of another interesting area of tension for her, because she's so she's so devoted to this idea of place. But rhetorically, there may have also been some ways that she was like, yeah, well, that belongs to all of us too. So yes, she does that stuff. That was a long answer for a short question.
Any other questions? Sorry, excuse me, any other questions? Do you go first and then?
How did she survive financially during her life? Did she work?
So she had a brother, and she had while her brother apparently got a lot of the father's inheritance. I don't think she was pleased about that. She had a trust fund, so you know, she was a trust fund artist. She was interested in book engagement, so she did occasionally try to do things for yeah, she did try to do kind of murals and things like that. So she was an artist. She did sell pieces. She was also, interestingly, she wrote. She was kind of what we would call maybe an esoteric journalist. So she wrote occult essays for places like Prediction. I think most of it, however, was the trust fund. You know, because she had, you know, she bought a studio in Hampstead, which, you know, that's kind of a nice place to live. So she was going back and forth, and I always want to, because she had this kind of cultivated sense of poverty that, you know, she had money, because if you can buy property in Hampstead, probably even back then, and where did you add? So, you know, there was that, but yeah, she did a lot of writing, and in fact, in the 70s, she did she had a very regular travel column in for the Times Literary Supplement. She did a lot of travel writing later in her life. So yeah, she did a bunch of kind of things to make money, but she wasn't a career girl outside of art. Great for the rest of us as well.
And then I think one question maybe.
Thanks, Amy. I've been reading some of your other work on traditionalism and the far right. Sorry, I haven't got there entirely, it's just I've been silent.
Oh, man, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Well, I'm sorry that we all had to go to that traditionalism place together, but yes.
But I mean, I find that really interesting. I guess I was interested in the kind of politics of these different moments that Ithell was involved in Cornwall. I mean, if you look at studies of kind of European occultism, esoteric, there's a rich theme of racism, specifically anti-Semitism, in that tied up with anti-modernism.
Yeah.
And I was kind of, yeah, I just wondered about the kind of the big P politics in a way of some of those movements. I know that there was some of those same tributaries or to that type of anti-modernist ideas of racial order or specifically anti-Semitism that you find on the continent, and whether that manifested.
Yeah, and yes, thank you for that. It's sadly, so much of that is just ugly, gross stuff.
Yeah.
And I actually started doing that kind of subset of my work actually tumbled out of understanding some of the things that I was seeing. So there's a little bit of historical context for how some of this stuff emerges. So if you read Dion Fortune, oh man, that's got, that's Dion Fortune is hard to read, there's just horrible explicit language in there that is just racist and anti-Semitic and horrid. I am grateful that you don't see that in Colquhoun's work. But what you do see, and what you see in say, for instance, John Michel, and in some of the people who kind of consider themselves earlier on to consider themselves more soft traditionalists in the René Guénon model is, well, no, I'm not racist. I'm just saying that every group has its own place and its own traditions, which come from its own landscape. That maybe everybody just needs to be in their own place, right? So it's this very spiritual kind of blood and soil argument that infuses this kind of native spirituality. Do you see that in Britain? 100% historically, absolutely. As I was saying, this and kind of alluding to the idea that, well, British Christianity doesn't really come from Jesus because we had the Druids here, which were really super Christian before Jesus comes along. And that cuts out a lot of groups that we might just really not want to be affiliated with, right? So I do believe that there's anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism in that whole thing that you get. But the iterations that we're seeing now, where we're getting, people who are kind of moving from, you still got that kind of soft traditionalism. And those people are always like, I'm not racist, I just think this. It's like, well, you are, but you actually get this what's emerged in really the past 15 years within traditionalism is, this radical traditionalism, which is much more explicitly white supremacist, anti-Semitic, anti-immigration. And that is, it's not like it hasn't always been there, but we've seen a really ugly turn in that, with people much more interested in Julia Zavala than René Guénon. So yes, it's always been there. I don't think, like Ithell, when she would write of these things, she's had a couple of moments that were saying things that I wish that she hadn't said. But, most of it was like, well, I don't think any of these traditions are bad. I just, think that, and it's later in life too. It's interesting. It's later in life. She's like, well, I just think that I should be doing this thing because I'm in this space. So she doesn't get overtly racist, but is it inherently racist? Okay. So, yeah, it's a problem. It's a real problem. It's obviously a real problem. And it's challenging and interesting to me when I'm working with this stuff, both historically, these nativist currents and where they go and how people, if involved in them, express them, feel about them, justify certain things on the basis of these really bad philosophical foundations.
I found it really useful for this. We're at a moment of war like this, where the reaction against modernity brings in a place like Cornwall as a particular focal point for
Absolutely.
rediscovery.
Absolutely.
That's a politically very ambiguous character that can go one way or the other.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I think, I've just found it really useful.
Oh, well, thank you, because there's absolutely no doubt that there are people who will use that rhetoric in a very opportunist way and will try to co-opt ideas of Cornishness, of Celticity, of, ethnic self-determination. There are people who will try to co-opt that and try to co-opt very good people here trying to do very good things and try to turn that into things that are really bad and wrong, so. Yeah.
Cool.
There's another question.
Yes, there is. I'm just also really aware that I haven't had any questions come through from Zoom. And whether that's just that the tech magic really isn't all working out in quite the same way that it should be. In which case, if anybody's got a question on Zoom, please kind of like burst in. I can also
Hello, I've won. Hello, can you hear me?
and then we'll go to
And I actually think I can only do maybe a couple more because I believe my ride is coming fairly soon.
cool. So we'll take Tim's question and then your question, Zoe, and then yeah. Tim.
Hi, can you hear me? I did put it in the chat. Thanks a million. That was great. The question was, I'll just read out my own question from the chat, which was quick one about the designation of Colquhoun as fiercely anti-modern and a traditionalist with a capital T, as he put it. This came to mind because I was teaching an undergraduate lecture on modernism and the occult this morning. So it occurred to me that you could very easily put her under a broad modernist umbrella in terms of her work as well. That as a surrealist, we could put surrealism under modernism and all the rest of it. And the Yeats connection is significant here too. The Golden Dawn stuff and Yeats's tradition fetish produces ultimately his most modernist work. So I just wondered if you'd any thoughts on the idea of Colquhoun as a modernist and of the tension between doing the modernist thing of making it new in her own aesthetic output and the traditionist with a capital T, anti-modernist thing. Thank you.
Sure, that's a really good question. So I think you're right. I think that Colquhoun absolutely is a modernist. I don't know where to look because you have no face. You're disembodied. So Colquhoun, maybe camera. There we go, camera. She's absolutely a modernist. I think that certainly contemporary, what we know of the occult movement at the time that she was doing the occult, her whole life as the occult emerges, it is firmly in a foundation of modernism. The art that she's doing is firmly within a modernist context. I think maybe the anti-modernism is not so much anti-modernism with capital M, because the other thing is that she's also really engaged with scientific discourses, with ideas of empiricism, the language of the visual, even the visual language of empiricism and repeatability and all that. But I think that her anti-modernism is really kind of more of an economic and social and cultural issue that comes out of her ideas of perennialism and a pure golden age. And I think that it's really about things like maybe economic and cultural development, where we see this kind of primitivism, this anti-technology, anti-modernism. I think that's how it plays out in her work, not so much in a lot of what she does, which would be definitely, absolutely 100% modernist. I don't know if that was helpful.
Nice one. Thank you so much. And yeah.
Yeah,
So
really quick one, thank you. Yeah, it's been really interesting. I've lived in Cornwall for 10 years. Like her, I'm down from London, and I've seen this sort of rise in awareness and conversation and reflection on the work of Ithell Colquhoun during that time. And I wonder if this is something that anyone's sort of looking at, the dynamics of how a woman like her could do this work and sort of be in certain areas at least sort of ignored or demeaned. Or I don't know, I'm no expert, and so I suppose that's my question in a way, is like, why did I not know about her before, and what has been the dynamics almost of the resurgence of awareness and work around attention to her, and for people I think I wanted to make, there's a lot of people working like that who are now, who are being ignored still. And if anyone's interested tonight, there's the Falmouth Pagan route in the Seven Stars at 7:30, we'll be looking at approaches to love through a pagan lens. So-
Oh, yes. Yes, happy Valentine's Day.
Some of them are probably there. People will be remembered in 50 years or whatever. But, you know.
No, that's a really great question, because you're right, you know, when I started working with Colquhoun's material, you know, almost quarter century ago, and nobody had heard of her, and while she had some, you know, success and fortunes within her life, there was no way that a lot of her work could have, I think, been, I really think that now is a time when we can start understand, she was very uncompromised. And I think that the kinds of things that she was doing, we are now socially reevaluating. You know, there are a number of currents coming together right now that are creating this kind of perfect storm of reasons why Colquhoun's work is of interest. And, you know, we start really seeing this, I think I kind of put it back with the Dark Monarch exhibition at Tate St. Ives in 2009, which is where a lot of people actually found out about who she was, because Tate put some of her things out for the first time in her library. But we have a rise of interest in women's art, a new renewed interest in surrealism, a new interest in women surrealists. We are, in my view, reevaluating the, you know, what we call the occult, the esoteric, the pagan. We are kind of, I think, reevaluating how we do that in what's called the West, uncomfortably and awkwardly. We're kind of, I think, shifting that into a much more universal conversation about spirituality and religiosity. So we know that everybody does this. We know that everybody in the world does this, including people in, quote, the West. And we're now shifting it so that we can talk about these as much wider phenomena and religious experiences and spiritual experiences. And so I think that a lot of these things which were marginalized, we're starting to have conversations about, and Colquhoun just happens to fit into all of that. Also, of course, the fact that even if she would not have identified as queer, there are lots of queer elements in her work, homoerotic elements in her work. And you know, we are also having really good conversations about that, about gender. And so it is really her moment. It couldn't have been even like 10 or 15 years ago, but it is now.
Super job. Well, thank you so much, Amy.
Oh, thank you. You know, feel free to be in touch, and if you have questions or comments, you know, hit me up, and if you want to come down to Bend on Friday, let's.
Thanks again.
Oh, thank you, Jody.
Thanks everybody that joined us online.
Thanks, everyone.
For being here now.
Yeah.